Are we there? Thank you. So this is Broadland Council Cabinet meeting, and you're very welcome as we have our deliberations here. I'm going to move on to the first item, which is declarations of interest. Does anybody have any interest to declare? Okay, thank you. In that case, apologies for absence. Do we have apologies for absence, please?
Yes, Chairman, I've received apologies from Councillors Beadle and Roper.
In that case, I'll move us on to item 3, which is the minutes of the Cabinet meeting held on the 5th of December. Does anybody have any... Sorry, Phil, yes.
No, my apologies. Just in terms of the final item under the line for NEC, just to declare an interest that both myself and Debbie Lorimer are directors of NEC.
Thank you. Have we recorded that? Thanks very much. Okay. In that case, I will move on to item... No other declarations of interest then? No?
Sorry, I should declare my interest as being on the member board for NEC.
Thank you. All right. In that case, I will move us on to the minutes, item 3, which, does anybody have anything to say about the minutes of the accuracy or otherwise, or matters arising from those minutes? So item 4 then, public speaking. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak at this meeting? No. Okay. In that case, if it's item 5, Nick, that's you, I think. Would you like to have a word about your deliberations? Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very long agenda. We went from the sublime to ridiculous. I think we went from one meeting, which we were all done in about half an hour, to this massively long agenda. Most items went through with pretty much full support. There was one or two hands up in other ways, particularly regarding the issue around, I'm just trying to find where, under which item it was, or whether it's actually on here, but the one which caused the only split really in the vote was the one where my casting vote was required, which was relating to the change to earmark reserves. I genuinely believe the concerns from the opposition were not political in the sense that they were trying to cause trouble. I think they've got genuine questions about a lack of clarity at present as to where and what capital programmes the funds might be put towards. I know that there was some clarification that this money being moved from the earmark reserves will be put towards the programme which is already in existence. I think there was some discussion around the fact that in principle, the principle wasn't wrong, but without a clarity as yet to come forward about what programmes this would go towards. I understood their concerns, and had I been an opposition member on ONS, I would probably have voted along with them if it was their party making these decisions. So I understood, and I did express in the meeting that although I was using my casting vote to support this matter, and it was passed, I understood their concerns and expressed their concerns around that. So obviously that will come forward at some point when the council's plans go forward as to what we are funding and what will be held back. But everything else went through with some really good discussion, and everyone felt, I think, that everything else on there was well worthy of support. But if they feel differently, I'm sure they're going to say something. So I'll leave it to them without me talking too much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think we're all aware that we all know that overview and scrutiny is not a political statement being made at all. I'm sure that members were only concerned about what the prospects were for the rearrangements of the earmarked reserve. I completely understand that, and I think it's perfectly possible, I hope, that you'll all find the responses you're given this evening will actually clarify exactly what the purposes of this is. So I don't think your concerns about opposition members saying things is relevant. I think we all understand this is not a political statement. It's more about a question of clarity, and I think we'll clear that up tonight, if that's all right.
Yeah, and I'd want to stress that. And at the time, I think their decision that made was based on a genuine questions, and not just to be difficult. That was the point I was trying to make. It was they were asking genuine questions, made a series of actually rather good points for clarification, and I wanted to emphasise that sense that it wasn't through being awkward or difficult. I think they're asking genuine questions, and I think they continue to have further questions regarding this going forward until those answers come forward to them. So I wanted them to make sure, wanted that just to be made clear.
Thank you, and I think we've all understood that loud and clear. So hopefully those answers will come forward at this meeting, and we'll see where we get. Sorry, I should have had that on loudspeaker. I'll start again. I'd remind you that this is item 6, representations from non-cabinet members, and you have 3 minutes per non-cabinet member. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, and I see Jo's had her hand up, by all means, do that now.
Thank you, Chair. That's really kind. I would like to speak on earmarked reserves. I would like to say I'm very disappointed to see the Economic Success Fund of 279,000 is being finished. That was used quite a lot before the COVID period. I think we had COVID funding during COVID. That's why it hasn't been used very much. And then we've had a change of assistant director, and that's why it wasn't utilised. It has been used to fund our Choices programme, which helps people with low self-esteem back into work, and that was a very successful programme, and it didn't cost an awful lot. It also has been used to support our town teams and public realm improvements in our towns, also to help SMEs. And I know I've spoken recently to the Pride and Place relationship manager, Andrew, and I understand the funding for communities runs out, and I think that fund had economic development points as well, but that funding runs out in April 25, so I think there is a need to keep the economic development fund. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any points to raise?
Thank you. I too was on the earmarked reserves, and that was around the compulsory purchase order. I think, so you'll remember from...
I just remind you that that is under exempt papers, I believe, is it not?
No, this is the CPO reserve.
Oh.
And I think the Chair, you'll remember from overview and scrutiny when we discussed this at length around there was very good discussions at a point in time where it was created, and around the ability to have 2 CPOs going forward at the same time. With a restriction on what's happened with this reserve, this will only allow 1 to be taken forward. Therefore, I will not be supported of it. I'd also like to speak on an item from the exempt paper, so I'll wait until afterwards.
Right, thank you very much. Sorry, my mistake. Thank you for those comments. I'm sure they'll be clarified as we go forward. Thank you. In that case, can I move us on to the Treasury Management Q2 report, please? And I think that's Rodney will be giving us an overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet and Council agree a Treasury Management strategy each year, and it's a requirement that we come back to Cabinet during the year just to report on progress against that capital strategy. So this report is just an update in the year of our Treasury Management activities. Key things to point out is at the end of September we had £38 million in investments, and it's pleasing to report that the interest earnings we're getting on those investments is significantly above budget. So budget was 1.1 million, and we expect at the end of the year to get 1.7 million. The reason for the increase is very much twofold. We've had slightly more cash than we expected, but more importantly, we're seeing a significant increase in interest rates, and obviously the higher the interest rates, the more interest you earn. Just need to also formally report back that we haven't had a need to borrow this year, and indeed we're not expecting to see a need to borrow at all this year. The other thing we just need to report back to Cabinet is very much that actually we have a number of prudential indicators. We're kept within all those prudential indicators, and therefore there's nothing to report back of any breaches of those indicators. But very much this report is for members to consider and to note. Thank you. Thank you,
Rodney. I'll ask the portfolio holder. Steve, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
Yes, as Rodney has quite rightly said, the potential indicators are what they are. Looking forward on the Treasury on predicted interest rates, etc. At the moment, as Rodney said, we've got 38 million to invest. However, there is concern, just as a note on this, we should reset the report, obviously, as a note report, because this picture of where we are right now, not talking about the future, but in the future we will have to actually have a look at this, because on the previous administration's commitment to capital spend, the investment income could go down by a third next year, because the previous administration's commitment to capital spend, which may be as much as 10 million next year, or this year coming, which would effectively reduce the investment income, even if interest rates stayed as they are throughout the year. So that's a cause for concern, Chair. Just as a note, really.
Thank you. Noted. I think I'm aware that you and Rodney have been putting a lot of work into this, and so we do need to be very careful, and I'm sure we will all follow that through, and we'll look to see how we manage that in the future. Does anybody else have any comments they'd like to make? In that case, I'd like us to move to the recommendations, which are to endorse the Treasury activity for the first half of the year and note that it complies with the agreed strategy, and secondly, to note the prudential indicators for the first 6 months of the year. Are we all happy to do that? Thank you. Lovely. Okay. So in that case, I will move us on to item 8. Which is the changes to earmarked reserves. Now, we've heard some comments about that, so hopefully some of those questions will be answered as we go through this discussion. Is that Rodney? It'll be you again, won't it?
Thank you, Chair. Cabinet will recall that back on the 10th of October, you received a report, a considered report on the medium-term financial position and a reserve update report. And as part of that, it was identified that there was a need to reduce the call on the general fund in order to fund the capital programme. So very much we've got a significant capital programme, and in order to fund that we were planning to use some of earmarked reserves and some of our general reserves. And indeed the amount of general reserves we were planning to use was more than we really should use, and therefore we took action from that meeting to look at options to actually address this going forward. So there's various ways you can address this. But one of the ways you can address this is to see if some of your existing earmarked reserves could be repurposed to fund the capital programme. So this report is one of those strategies to actually try and reduce the draw on the general reserve. This report is not proposing any changes to the capital programme. The capital programme is exactly as it is. This is a report just about how can we fund the expenditure that's in the existing capital programme. So what we've gone through is looked at all the council's earmarked reserves and see if there's any ability to actually repurpose any of these, see if any of the reserves aren't actively being used. And as part of this, we've identified 3 reserves where we think they could be closed. That's the Economic Success Fund, the Housing Assistance Policy Fund, and the Neighbourhoods Plans Reserve. And the other one we thought we could reduce is potentially the Compulsory Purchase Order Reserve. If I just pause on that compulsory purchase order reserve, within it at the moment there's £650,000, which would give you sufficient resource to pursue 2 CPOs at the same time. I don't think we've ever pursued 2 CPOs concurrently like that, so we think there is some opportunity to reduce that slightly by £250,000, which would still give you the opportunity to pursue one, and then once that one's concluded, potentially move another one. So it would just change your ability to how many you can do at one time. But obviously there's also a capacity on officer time in how many you can actually do at one time, because these are a very time-consuming process. We have set out very much in detail some of the use of these earmarked reserves over time, and I think hopefully you can see in the appendix there's been very little use of the 3 earmarked reserves, suggesting could be sort of closed down over the past couple of years. And it is correct to say actually it's nice to have these reserves in case projects do come up in the future. So if there were some programmes you'd like to fund from the economic fund, there's nothing in this that will stop you, if a programme comes forward in the future, for you to consider it and then decide how you're going to fund that once we come up with a programme. But it does seem a bit like you're keeping money just in case you come up with a scheme, instead of saying let's use the money on what we know we've got to spend on, and then when we do come up with schemes we can come back and say, well actually how can we fund these new schemes going forward. So hopefully the proposals before you are a sensible proposition in order to help to fund the current capital programme. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. If I can move over then, Steve, I believe that's you again. Would you like to make some comments on that?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, basically this all comes from, as Rodney's indicated, the need to look at the earmark reserves, have an examination to see what is actually being used or not used at the moment. So quite a bit of work went in, as you can see on the appendix 2-4 going forward, in the earmark reserves, and then these four are picked out in the lighter version of the print, and you can see that they actually haven't been used. So the whole point here is that from the Cabinet meeting in February, 5.5 million was also indicated as being required from the General Reserve. There's a total in the General Reserve to fund the capital programme. That effectively means that there are capital commitments, including the IT upgrade, also the resource issues around customer service. A number of capital commitments have already been made and therefore they need to be funded. So therefore, if we're looking at earmark reserves that are not spending any money at the moment, you should really repurpose these to ensure that we've got our capital programmes and previous commitments around capital programmes, even though we do need to review them, covered to make sure the council is running in a prudent manner. We also, in October, committed to, which we hadn't done before, to ensure that we follow the government's recommendations and hold in general reserves a minimum of 1.4 million, which is roughly 10% of revenue, to cover any shortfalls or stress testing which can occur during your financial budget. For instance, pay increase might end up higher than what you originally planned for. So you must have a reserve in order to be able to cover any fluxes backwards and forwards during that financial year. So a minimum of 1.4 is needed. As it stood, 5.5 million being committed to capital programme would allow us no reserve, no leeway, and as a council, no council can run like that actually. County run at a 5% reserve, we would be run at a 10%. County is recognised as being quite low actually, but 10% is recommended from government. So this is what this is doing. In relation to any programmes that come forward, I've heard the point made around choices, there actually hasn't been any use of that. However, we was talking, I think it was £2,000 previously spent on that. This does not stop this council from supporting such a policy because we can fund it from elsewhere. It's just that these earmark reserves, with this manager sitting here, and the quantity in those earmark reserves are actually required to fund the capital commitments. And we can't just have them sitting there and not spend money on the capital commitments. So it's completely logical and prudent for us to be doing this, Chair. So fully support this and the work that's gone into it.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any comment to make? Yes. Well, Martin first and then Natasha.
Yeah, I'm just going to support you using the business reserve up because it's hardly been used. Even when it was being used, the most that's ever taken out of it was 22,000, and that was in 1920, and really, to keep 279,000 sitting there for no apparent purpose, when we are desperate for money for the capital programme, just seems to me a completely logical use. And the £2,000 for the Choices programme can obviously be found out of our own budget anyway. So it's just no point having a reserve just sitting there. It's quite pointless.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as another portfolio holder who's affected by the closure of these funds, I am in support. And Joe, I did welcome your comments about the Choices programme. I have actually had a conversation with Mike. There he is. We are looking at repurposing that fund. Mike is currently working on some wording around the Choices programme, so it's not being done away with. It might be rebranded a little bit, jazzed up perhaps, but as others have said, even if we wanted to carry on with it exactly as it is, £2,000 is not a lot of money to find, and I'm sure we could if we wanted to, but we are working on improving on it as part of a wider thing, and I'm sure Mike will come forward with something at a later date. Thank you.
Oh, you. So I think I'm hoping that's answered the questions, because I think it's quite clear what we're actually trying to do here is we're not doing away with things, and we're not trying to find this money to sort of spend on something else. There is a capital programme which is already committed to, which actually originally used the entire general reserve, which we cannot do. We need to have our 10%. So that's really what this is about. These earmarked reserves were not doing something. We're not spending them or putting them somewhere else. They are going to fund the capital programme. That's what it's for. So I don't think that the concerns that have been raised need to be taken on board particularly, because that's not what we're doing. I think there might be a misunderstanding about why we're moving them. So I hope that's answered your questions. We very much support any programme that helps people with getting into work, all of those sorts of choices, programmes and so on, business builders, all these things are very much something that we want to be committed to, and we're not suggesting for 1 minute we would do away with those. We're just changing the way the earmarked reserves work, so it doesn't affect anything else. So I hope that's helpful. So if I could take us then to the earmarked reserves paper and the actual recommendations, which was to agree to, this is just to close the reserves, it's not to spend the money, to close the Economic Success Fund Reserve, the Housing Assistance Policy Reserve, the Neighbourhood Plans Front Runner Reserve and the Compulsory Purchase Order Reserve, and transfer them to the new Capital Funding Reserve, which will fund the capital programme as it stands, I believe.
Chair, if I could, sorry, it was to reduce the compulsory purchase order.
I beg your pardon, not close it. I do beg your pardon. I got overexcited. That was to reduce it.
Thank you, Trevor. I was just going to...
We're reducing it, not... Are we all noting that? Okay. Are we all happy with those recommendations? Would we like to support those? Thank you. Lovely. All right, so I do hope that's helpful. Right, so page 28, I think you'll find, is the next one, which is the charging policy, and that seems to be you again, Rodney. Thank you.
Yes, 3 in a row. I don't know if I get a prize for 3 in a row, but we'll see. So, very much, this is the charging policy. It's good practice as a council just to set out our principles for charging. This report is not about setting specific fees and charges, it's setting that overall framework, those principles. And very much we're trying to suggest there might be a good practice of 3 principles. First one, to make sure that fees and charges should cover the full cost of the service. The second principle is that actually it's perfectly acceptable to actually change your charging policies to reflect the needs of people on low incomes and to encourage those people to be able to afford the services. And thirdly, just a good practice one to try and make sure that if possible, we should get the income in advance of providing a service. So, for instance, for the garden waste charges, we ask people to pay for that in advance of providing the service. It's just good practice. And something like principle 2, for something like the bulky waste collection, you give people a discount on low incomes to be able to afford to provide that service. So I think these are very much in line with your current arrangements anyhow. It's just very much codifying what we currently do. I think just need to say about the fees and charges covering the cost of the services. We haven't got discretion to set all our own fees and charges. Something like planning fees is a statutory fee, so we don't have any discretion to set those. So this policy only applies to those fees and charges that we have control to actually set. And the idea being actually, if it's a discretionary service, there's a cost of providing that service and who has to pay for it. Is it the person who actually benefits from that service, or is it the general taxpayer? And this is very much saying for discretionary services, we should try and make sure that where possible, the cost of providing discretionary services is covered by the people using those services. But that was all I was going to say on the paper, and open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney.
Yes, and of course it reflects as well the local government guidance in regards to recovery of costs, SERCOP, which specifies that services should recover all costs in organisations, including proportion of all central overhead, depreciation, interest and working capital costs as well. So it's in line with the local government guidance COP as well, and quite appropriate that we should actually just say what we mean here and say those 3 points on page, just lost my page now, Chair. Yeah. Principle 1, Principle 2, Principle 3, all fees charges should aim to cover for costs, services. Where appropriate, consideration should be given to establishing pricing structure that caters for people on low incomes, which we are doing. There'll be a means test around that, where people are in receipt of benefits. Principle 3, where possible charges should be collected in advance of services. So they're the 3 principles, they are in line with CERCOP, Chair. So, yeah, recommend we accept.
Thank you. Anybody got comments? No. So I think basically we're saying that this is we're actually just putting it in a policy, the things that we've been doing already. I think that they're all very clear. I absolutely take the principle that if it's a discretionary service, then we shouldn't be expecting the general taxpayer to pay for it. So I think it's appropriate to do it, and I think it's also appropriate to make sure that we are considering all those items, including the possibility for people on low incomes to be able to benefit from them as necessary. So are we all happy with those recommendations then? Thank you very much. So we approve that charging policy. Thank you. This brings us on to the Greater Norwich 5-year infrastructure investment plan. That trips off the tongue nicely, doesn't it? And that will be led by Paul, I believe, and I'll introduce you. If you'd like to introduce that for us, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, so if you hear me refer to the 5-YIP, that's what I'm referring to. Most members would always come to know that planning policy loves an abbreviation or an acronym because we have unwieldy titles. Looking around the room, I'm very conscious that members will have already seen this report, at least the vast majority of them, either be it through the Greater Norwich Growth Board, Community Housing Planning Policy Panel, or indeed an overview and scrutiny. So I'll do my best to be brief. I suspect members are already acutely aware of what community infrastructure levy is, where we charge it and how we pool it. So I'll take that as read. But as part of those pooling arrangements across Greater Norwich, so district areas of Broadland, Norwich and South Norfolk, each year we come together as 3 independent authorities to decide how to invest that SIL. And this is the report that you have in front of you today. And indeed, this decision follows on from a recommendation of the Greater Norwich Growth Board. Within the report, as you'll have noted on page 40, with some further details on page 65 and 66, there are 3 specific proposals for SIL funding this year. The first being Aylsham Gym and Fitness Hub. This is the 3rd phase of a scheme that's being delivered by the high school in Aylsham, relates to the delivery of a 40-station gym and multi-fitness studio and changing facilities to build onto their existing facilities of a refurbished pool and a 3G artificial grass football pitch, which they use both for the benefit of the community and indeed the school itself, and the same is proposed for this scheme here. The second of the schemes proposed for funding this year is Eaton Park, obviously within the Norwich City area, but a well-used park that people across the wider area use, with that investment going into the renovation of the changing rooms there, the installation of some green technologies related to those changing room facilities, and additional signage and cycle storage, with the final scheme being an extension to Plumstead Road Library, which will provide a multi-use space, kitchen and a disabled access toilet, and enables them to essentially provide further services and run further events at that library. In addition to those 3 specific schemes, it's also proposed that £2.5 million is allocated to the Education Capital Programme, and that is to be used to expand Wyndham High School. It's the last stage of expansion there to accommodate the significant growth that's occurred in and around that area. And that's essentially the decisions for the investment of SIL in infrastructure projects that's before Cabinet today. It's perhaps worth noting, as it's referred to in the report itself and the wider background papers, that it is also proposed that £650,000 worth of SIL is earmarked to allow for a further expansion of the nest. This is from the match funding pot. Members may remember this was a new stream of funding that was set up last year. The mechanism for that is slightly different. So the decision on where allocation should be made from that match funding pot lies with the Greater Norwich Growth Board. The decision that sits before the councils is how much funding should sit within that pot. Last year, £4 million was agreed to be allocated in it. 650,000 has been earmarked this year. That still leaves a significant sum in that pot, and it's not proposed to increase that match funding pot further. And as such, there's no decision to increase the match fund before council. It's perhaps worth noting that a further stream was also created last year for major infrastructure projects. That's to earmark funding over a longer time scale, really. Most of the infrastructure projects we looked at are quite short term. That looks longer term, but there's nothing proposed in it this year. But the fact that the match fund is being used shows that those streams are already live and operating. The other thing to note in terms of a use of SIL rather than a direct investment is that it is proposed that £4.5 million is allocated from the City Deals Borrowing Loans Fund for delivery of the Long Stratton Bypass. That is borrowing, but it's underwritten by SIL in the first instance, albeit that additional loan funding is to be repaid by the development, as I understand it. And one of the recommendations that we'll come on to relates to some further legal changes that need to be made to allow that fund to operate. In essence, that's what I was going to say, and that is what the recommendations relate to. Just a few further clarifications around the recommendation. Well, recommendation 1 stands for itself in terms of its decision to invest. Recommendation 2 is about including the 2 specific projects within Broadland within the council's capital programme. There is a rogue S in there. It should say include, not include, so my apologies for that. For the avoidance of doubt, just because this caused some confusion at another committee, it's worth noting that isn't additional funding. That's just accounting for the SIL fund that's invested. It's really a mechanism in financing for how we administer the fund. So we would initially pay out the sums on completion to the work, to the delivery body in question, and then we'd recoup it from SIL. In certain instances, if an organisation is large enough, there'll be a direct relationship between the Greater Norwich project team at county and the individual body delivering the infrastructure itself. But that's not always the case. So I've included them both here, really on a precautionary basis, but certainly with the Nest, they're such a big organisation that controls that. I suspect the relationship will be direct, but it's there as a precautionary element. Moving on to the third of the recommendations there. This is new this year. Members will again know that the sort of SIL infrastructure investment fund is administered by the Greater Norwich Projects team. That's a team which sits at county, but it's funded jointly by the SIL partners and works on our behalf to manage that fund. Over time, their role has expanded significantly. So they not only manage the infrastructure fund now, they manage the City Deal Borrowing Loans Fund, which we referred to in relation to Long Stratton, the investment there. They act as client-side project managers for a couple of key infrastructure streams, the physical activity and sports strategy and its subsequent implementation thereof, and indeed the emerging Greater Norwich Green Infrastructure strategy. So recognising that expanded role and the critical role that they play in the delivery of infrastructure, and the recognition that that team needs to enlarge in order to deliver that, it's proposed that this year we invest £115,000 of pooled SIL. It's worth saying it is the pooled SIL pot, it's not the admin charge that we retain, it's not the neighbourhood plan element that's provided to, the neighbourhood element, not necessarily the neighbourhood plan element, that's provided to individual parishes and town councils. It is from the pool pot to support that wider work. You'll know it's in the region of figure. That's just because the exact detail of what that sum is being agreed as part of looking at the salaries of the relevant post holders there. I'm assured that that's in the region of means close to, but you'll see there's through the delegations there to the Director of Place and the portfolio holder for policy, we've got some security in there to make sure that doesn't go too significantly up or down. The fourth of the recommendations there just relates to a further legal deed of variation to the, and this is something I don't have an abbreviation for, so I'll read it out in full, the partner drawdown and borrowing authorisations agreement. Members with a long enough memory will remember we agreed some changes last year. It's been identified some further changes are required. This simply looks for authorisation to agree it. It's worth noting that as this went through Cabinet at South Norfolk yesterday, there were some questions around how the parties were specified in that agreement. My understanding, it was just legalese around it, but having had a further exchange post that, it might be that they need to be tweaked. So I'm just, we can progress that directly with the Greater Norwich Projects team as part of the agreement, but it's just for noting of this Cabinet. Hopefully I've not taken up too much of your time, and I'll close there.
Thank you. Yes, so I think it's quite clear, isn't it, that it's quite successful, this SIL programme and the Greater Norwich Growth Board. I think we're all happy with that. The particular recommendations, it's good to see that the Elsham Gym and the Fitness Hub is getting underway, and the Nest, of course, is extremely popular, I know, and you know, doing really well. I think you're right to clarify, and I hope I'll clarify this for everybody. This isn't about us spending our money. This is about the money that's coming from the Greater Norwich Growth Board, pooled money to fund these things. So it's not that we're spending 115,000 extra on admin. This will be coming out of that pooled pot. And I think that just goes to show the success of the project, actually, the fact that we need more people to manage it for us because it's doing so well. So thank you for that. And I must admit, I thought it was just legalese because I sort of looked at the deed of variation and thought, oh, crikey. So if there is something that needs to be amended, I'm sure they will do that. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to me to be very problematic, and these things happen quite often, I think, in these sort of legal documents. So I'm happy to keep an eye on that for everybody and make sure, as you will, I'm sure, Paul, just to make sure that goes through. Okay, does anybody else have any questions on that one?
Thank you very much, Paul, for a very comprehensive run through. I mean, there is a lot here. It is there's a lot to get around, and I think just a general point around perhaps future funding, which you know, I'd certainly like to see, is given that we as a council have declared a climate and biodiversity emergency. And it is an emergency, and we ought to ensure that there is priority funding going into projects that actually address, or at least take into consideration, the impact on the climate and our biodiversity. So there are some very good projects in here, which is good to see. There are some that perhaps, if I'd been in earlier, I might have had earlier in terms of the allocations, which have now gone forward, I might have questioned. But it's just a point to make that I'm certainly would be interested in looking at how we can influence that funding and our partners in this partnership to be able to address those issues that we've highlighted as a council. Having said that, it's good to see that you know, there are priorities in terms of promoting health and well-being, which I'd certainly support. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think what I would say about that is I think more and more of these projects that come forward are looking at those sorts of things, and certainly it's something that I question when things come forward. There's a particular project that's coming forward in Norwich at the moment, which is to do with Slybottom Park, and that is also related to the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, which has got a bit of land which is adjacent to that, and the whole thing is tied up there. So it's actually looking, and there's some government funding coming to support that as well. So there's a lot of environmental and biodiversity stuff that we need to be aware of, and I think it's gradually increasing as we start looking at this programme. So while I take your point, I think that is gradually building up as well as part of the basis for this. So do you have any comment, Paul?
The point I would make, in paragraph 3.6 of the report, you'll get a link there to the Greater Norwich Digital Data Dashboard. That shows the different projects that have been invested in. And actually, I think an awful lot of those are supporting community green infrastructure or transport projects, which would actually help address a number of the issues that Councillor Davis has pointed to there. I think the other point I'd make, particularly around transport and green infrastructure, just the two areas he's pointed to, is really when we look at certainly the sort of transport for Norwich area, so that's the built-up area of Norwich and its immediate fringe and around. The major investments in there in the very recent past have been around the Transforming Cities Fund. We worked quite closely with the County Council in preparing that programme. It was substantially funded by government grants, albeit supported by a degree of SIL in there. And part of our overall infrastructure programme will need to rely on government grants because there won't be enough money coming through this source independently. But that was very clearly focused on the type of transport improvements that I think you're wanting to see in recognition of the issues that you've identified. I think similarly, when I referred to some of the work that's ongoing around the Greater Norwich Green Infrastructure strategy, that is all about thinking about, well, how can we deliver green infrastructure in a way which, yes, supports recreation and physical activity, but also biodiversity. It's being done with the County Council, who you all know are responsible for the local nature recovery strategy. So there's an opportunity to make sure those two things tie up. So I think we're acutely aware of the issues that you're pointing to, and there are pieces of work ongoing to make sure that we are delivering on those outcomes.
Thank you. Yes, I think you did just mention the dashboard as well. I think if anybody is interested, I would urge you to go have a look, because it's a new thing that they've brought forward and it really works well. You can actually click on the various councils involved. You can click on various projects. It will give you all sorts of data. It's actually it's been put together very well. So I recommend you have a look at it if you want to see what the Greater Norwich Growth Board is all about, basically. So feel free to avail yourself of that one. Can I therefore move us to the recommendations, which are that we approve the 5-year infrastructure investment plan for 24 to 29 and the proposed annual growth programme as set out in Appendix A. We include the Aylsham Gym and Fitness Hub totalling 400,000, the Nest Multi-Sport Indoor Community Hub totalling 650,000 into the Council's capital programme commencing in 24-25, and that is from the pooled SIL. And that we approve a new programme management fee, which will also come from the SIL, which will be in the region of £115,000, which will delegate authority to the Director of Place and the leader to oversee that. And finally, the deed of variation for the partner drawdown and borrowing authorisations, which the original was signed on 21st of October 2015. Things change over years. This is a legal requirement and I think fits the programme that we're doing. Are we all happy to accept those recommendations?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So if I move us on then to item 11, the lead officers on this, is that Chris? Yes, thank you, Chris. Would you like to come and explain all of this to us as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this item is regarding the Halfgate and Tunstall Conservation Area appraisal. We have 21 conservation areas in Broadland, designated from various times since the 70s, and it's a duty of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act to review those conservation areas and the boundaries to ensure that they're up to date, particularly important for making planning decisions, and when we have cases going to planning appeal and the planning inspectorate, they find an up-to-date appraisal very useful for determining applications. So this one's slightly unusual in that it's being carried out by the Broads Authority on our behalf. If you look at the map on page 149, it sort of shows how related it is to the the Broads authority area, which is a local planning authority area for that jurisdiction. So they kindly offered to do the appraisal for us. So they've carried out the appraisal in accordance with the Historic England guidance note, going through the various stages of assessing the area. So they're looking at the character of the area and appearance in terms of materials, building types, relationship of buildings to open spaces, important bits of landscape or ponds, etc. The history of the settlement, how it's evolved. In this case, it's sort of quite connected to the Broads. Also importantly, they look at the management enhancement opportunities, so anything which is could be improved. That's not necessarily, there's no sort of onus on homeowners to actually carry out those improvements or for the parish council to say the improvements. It's more of a list of opportunities where we look, if you have the funding or the capabilities of doing it, that would be an opportunity to enhance the area. They've carried, after carrying out the appraisal, they actually recommended that there was no boundary changes, so we don't have to approve any boundary changes today. We're just looking at the adoption of the appraisal. So once it goes to council, that will be the adoption date, and we'll put it on the website. As part of the process they carried out for public consultation, part of the requirements of the Act is that you carry out a public meeting and invite attendees, put village notices up, leaflet drop, local houses. So we have feedback from that in the report. After they just say that the Broads Authority adopted the appraisal at their planning committee in September, so it's already been to their committee. It went to our Communities Housing and Planning Policy Development Panel on the 13th of December. They raised two issues. Firstly, about Article 4 directions and why hadn't we suggested Article 4 for this area. The Article 4 is a specific planning requirement which is used in conservation areas where there's a particular historic character or architectural character which is above sort of important to preserve and protect. For example, in Broadland it would be the Reef and Marketplace and Charles Close, where you have quite a unified character. The officers thought in the case of Halvergate that it's too varied a character, it's quite a rural settlement and there's quite a lot of different house types, so it wasn't thought necessary to have one of those directions. Also, there's a resident raised the difference between the two planning authorities, between the Broadland Planning Authority and the Broads Authority, because we're two different planning authorities, and that wasn't made very clear, so it was updated. The proposal was updated to provide a bit more factual background on that case and pointing to the different local plans, etc. So, if anybody has any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's all quite clear, and I think, well, certainly I thought that the drop-in option had been quite good, hadn't it? There were some good questions that were raised, and they were well dealt with. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to this?
Yeah, I think the question raised by the communities panel planning, appropriate questions actually, because an Article 4 does dramatically change things, and I think when when you do a survey, a questionnaire to people, if there was an intent to implement Article 4, it has an effect on permitted building rights, so an extension of the back of your house or even a conservatory, which then gets a different response from residents entirely, because now you're having your actual rights restricted and just normal planning rights that you have with your house. So I thought it's a very relevant question when I read it from the planning communities committee, and well done them for trying to clarify that.
It's partly my just not being so familiar with management and enhancement proposals, but it is mentioned under 2.6 around a particular issue of the cottage that is in quite a state following a fire. But it does say here that those management and enhancement proposals are not supposed to be an obligation on the owner. But then what does it require in terms of under the management and enhancement proposal. Yeah.
As I said, we don't tend not to, particularly when it comes to individual properties. We don't sort of find it's sort of good purpose to sort of name and shame houses and say your house, and we can sort of identify and say, oh, it's it's beneficial, but we don't really sort of go at houses unless they're in a very, very bad state of repair, or they've been sort of empty for 10 years and missing owners, etc. I mean, this particular case, the owner very unfortunately had a fire and was uninsured, and he's still sort of living there on the sort of doing it up in the slow process of doing it up. So you had to take. We were drawn to it, the attention to it by the parish council quite early on, and it's a listed building, so we do want it to get repaired, but we're just being a bit sensitive to the situation that the owner found themselves in, and just sort of he's taking his time to do it.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable, isn't it? As I understood it, that is something that it is being worked on, and there are good reasons why it's taking time, as I understand it. So, but in all, I think that the consultation was good. I mean, there's some clear questions. There were one or two things, weren't there, that actually came up and have said, yes, we've been removed this or we've changed that. It was sort of an error. So I think actually it's been quite thorough. So I'm happy to recommend that we approve and adopt this conservation area appraisal. I believe we recommend that to council. Is everybody else happy with that? Yeah? Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us on to item 12 on page 221, which is related to the Corporate Peer Challenge. And the lead officer on that is Emma. Did you have something you want to say first, Emma, or are you happy to? Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think the visit was quite successful, I would have to say. I think there was some quite positive news to do with this. Most of those key points had been changed. We have very few orange measurements. They're all moving towards green. It was quite clear that they were working on the working out what the one team, we're trying to confirm and draw up a programme which shows and demonstrates, the things that are joint with our partners in collaboration in South Norfolk, the things that are separate, the things that belong to Broadland on its own, and things that are maybe some common features, because there is an element of all of those. And I think one of the things the peer review team came up with is that there needs to be some clarity over that. So that's something that's being worked on at the moment to make sure that that's the case. I think there were joint briefings happening when they are needed, and there are other opportunities possibly to be explored. Really, I think that the team were quite impressed. I think that was the only thing I can say, so I think that's quite useful. I don't know if anybody's got any other comments you'd like to make about it? No? We're all happy with that then? So I think in that case, are we recommending that that's just noted? Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. There's a lot of pages here, I'm just trying to find my way right to the right page. So, we'll move on to item 13, which is the Rural England Prosperity Fund. So I think that's Nina and Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So this paper refers to some funding that was allocated back in 2022, about £569,000 to Broadland District Council to support various activities in our area. So in November 22, we got agreement from Cabinet to do a business case for linked to the Broadland Food Innovation Centre. We subsequently appointed Lincoln University to do this quite specialist piece of work for us. So they've got the National Centre for Food Manufacturing, and they based their work on some previous work done by Collins and Associates when we set up the food and drink cluster as part of the ERDF funded project. And essentially they use that piece of work to use as a basis of what types of producers are in our geography, what types of businesses are here, and what types of equipment might be most used and useful in our location. So the review identified 3 pieces of equipment. The extrusion piece of equipment was selected, but the caveat was that it would need some dedicated resource to provide some ongoing expertise and resource to maintain that piece of equipment. So although we could buy it and it could go with one of the units, it comes with that caveat because it's quite a specialist piece of equipment. So in parallel with that, the BFIC leases were going well, and we've got leases now agreed for all of our units. So in conjunction with the 3 pieces of equipment that were identified, a 4th was suggested. Well, could we do something outside of the BFIC that could be used? So a freezer, blast chiller was looked at, and a small piece of market demand was done before Christmas. We felt that a line needed to be drawn under that piece of work because all the money needs to be spent by March 25. So we suggested that a more robust business case would be needed if we were to take that piece of that 4th option forward, because the response to the consultation, there was only 17 responses, and that was, I guess, a timing issue as well. So in parallel with the piece of the business case that we did, we have commenced some work on scoping out the 2nd kitchen at the BFIC, which is a requirement. And we had some work done on a content creation kitchen in terms of the scope and design. And in parallel with that, the business builder has worked incredibly well with high demand for growth, for grants, and a really good return on investment in terms of the match funding generated. So what's being proposed today is that we don't go with a single piece of equipment for the BFIC, but instead we'd redivert up to £200,000 to support the rural business builder, and we divert £50,000 to support our content creation kitchen, which will in actual fact mean that we don't have to use some of Broadland District Council's reserve to do that piece of work, because we had some contingency set aside to do that content kitchen as part of our agreement with DLUC. So I'll pause there for any questions. I hope that's okay.
Lovely, thank you, very clear. Martin, would you like to add anything?
I fully support this, because a test kitchen project, particularly as envisaged, which will be very social media friendly, will be a great boon for both the tenants that we've got, and it's going to be usable by outside companies as well. So it will be useful for them both testing their food and doing video promotions for it. So it's, to me, a very good use of the money. And obviously the Rural Business Builder Fund doesn't really need to say any more. That's obviously something that's really, really useful, really important. So I fully endorse moving the money into that rather than the piece of equipment, which was, our research has shown, was not going to be a good idea.
Yeah, just on finance on this and working with Martin as well. I think the key point about the pull on council's reserves as well. There was a contingency fund that was set up for this of 420, and repurposing in this way these various pots in the REPF is actual good targeted use of that, to say the least, and fully support this chair accordingly.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it probably sounds a little bit silly, a sort of social media kitchen. If you're not particularly social media savvy, you might not get what it's for, but the growth of food accounts on social media, as a self-declared greedy gut, I follow all of them, so I'm very much in favour. And the amount of organic growth that companies can get on TikTok and platforms like that, it's brilliant. So anything we can do to help businesses get that organic growth is really going to increase their market, and it could only be a good thing. So I fully support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Both stole my thunder. I was going to say, that's good news. It's not going to cost us anything. How wonderful. No, it does sound like a really good idea, so I'm more than happy to support this. And I think you can tell from all of us that we're very keen on that whole project. So thank you for that. I think there is recommendations to go through here, therefore. So basically, 1, to approve the use of the funds to deliver the test kitchen 2, which will be a content creation kitchen at a cost of up to 50,000. To divert the remaining funds into the Rural Business Builder programme, providing grants of up to £25,000 to eligible businesses. And 3, to delegate to the Assistant Director of Economic Growth, in consultation with the portfolio holder for economic development, the signing of contracts, agreements and procurement requirements associated with the delivery of this proposal, subject to appropriate legal and procurement advice. Are we all clear? And we're all happy to support those recommendations. Lovely. Yep. Thank you very much then. Okay. Thank you, ladies. Very good. So I move us on then to the forward plan on page 285. Bear with me while I flick towards it. Okay, so we are now in January 2024, and you'll see the forward plan there is listed up to somewhere like April, I believe, March or April 2024. Are we all happy with the items on that plan? Has anybody got anything we need to note that's any different? No? Okay, so thank you. We'll take that as noted then. That therefore brings us to item 15, which is the exclusion of the press and public. So I will move to that point, which I need to say. I move that the press and public be excluded from the meeting for the remaining items of business, because otherwise information which is exempt information by virtue of paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, as amended by the Local Government Access to Information Variation Order 2006, would be disclosed to them.